Very good evening. Welcome to our policy workshop, policy engagement, together with Nonku Thongwa and Tasneem Fredericks, who's the Deputy President of the BMF. Thank you very much for your time, colleagues, to help us think through certain key issues on the Companies Act Amendment Bill that has been in the pipeline for a couple of years, some of these amendments. And of course, from a BMF perspective, we are interested in specific line items on the amendment. And of course, we need to have a clear BMF view on some of those issues, which our colleagues, esteemed colleagues here, will unpack for us so that we have a better understanding of the BMF lenses as we understand the Companies Act in relation to the BMF mandate and the BMF ethos as well. So without wasting any further time, I'll hand over to Nonku and DP to take us through the presentation and the inputs. So please don't be afraid to ask questions, to engage our two guests so that we can come out of here with a better understanding and what the BMF has to say about some of these. So thank you very much. Nonku, over to you.
Thank you. It's unsorted now.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to join you. And DP, it's such a pleasure to work with you again and to be on this platform. And I'm keen to hear your views on the Companies Act amendments. And yeah, I think we can get straight on. Monde, do you want to take a break while we wait for people to start, or should we just go straight in?
I think let's go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So like as per the introduction, we are going through Companies Act and the amendments that have come through, the bill that has come through, and our view and, like Monde said, our perspective in terms of BMF on the bill and the changes thereof. So what I will go through is an overview of lawmaking in South Africa. What is the Companies Act? What does the bill want to change in the Act? And we will hear from the Deputy Chairperson on what the BMF perspective is on the amendments. So for those who are not clear, the way South Africa makes laws is that a bill is like a draft law that needs to be introduced to Parliament, either by a minister, a deputy minister, a committee member, or an individual MP. Before that law could be considered a law, it's called a bill, and it must be presented to both houses of Parliament. The bill is then published to the Government Gazette for public comment. And then once that has gone through, which is a process that we're in now, once that passes through, it goes back to the National Assembly, then it goes to the President. Only after the President has signed it does the bill become an act, and therefore it becomes the law. So that's where we are now in the public participation side of creating a law. So Companies Act governs companies. It talks about how they're incorporated, how they're registered, the organization, the management of it, how the company has a relationship with the shareholders, members of the public, or its directors. It also talks about how do they make deals and takeovers between themselves. And it carries on. It also, Companies Act gave rise to CIPC, and it talks about how CIPC then helps to administer the requirements of the Act. There are some challenges, it doesn't cover everything, and there are some challenges that we look at in terms of Companies Act and some shortcomings, and that's why every now and then it becomes an amendment. So one of them, it's human rights protection. So the Act does speak about Companies Act needing to follow the Constitution, but it's not all companies try and match how they operate with the human rights. So that's why we could see companies, some companies having an issue with the air quality, like how we have, and some companies overcharging or mistreating their employees. So we're just not tight enough in that area. Also, there's the pandemic now. As soon as the pandemic hit, companies had to run differently. So Companies Act didn't really cover that. there's been, for instance, on resolutions. Some companies need to meet in person to sign off on resolutions. And we already had a case now where a resolution was done on a round robin basis, which means you just send it around and people approve or not approve, the directors. And because it was not in line with the Companies Act, whatever was decided was turned around by the court. So we still have that where it's not in line with how we do business modern, and with the pandemic, and how the pandemic has affected us will definitely affect how we do business going forward. And then it also doesn't really cover shadow directors. So for instance, with the Zondo Commission, we heard how some directors had to take decisions based on what a minister said or a DG said. So the law covers us and said, whatever a director makes a decision on, it needs to be ethical and it can be tested against the law and the ethics and whether it's in the best interest of the company. But the shadow directors are not really covered. So going forward, these are some things that we will push for, to say that if a company doesn't do well because of an instruction from a shadow director, Companies Act needs to cover the shadow directors, and they need to be equally responsible for how the company acts or what happens from the result of the instruction that they gave. So the influence of shadow directors was very strong on state-owned entities, and they were not held, that we cannot at this stage hold them responsible in any way except maybe in ethics. But the Companies Act cannot hold them and say you didn't act in the best interest of the company. So those are some of the shortcomings that are there. And yeah, it doesn't cover everything. So on the draft Companies Act, which the Minister of Trade and Industry published, and it's open for public comment for only 30 days, unfortunately. So we have a short time to put in our inputs. It goes through a few changes. Some of them are directors' remuneration, whether companies need to share or not share their financials. Is it a public document or not? Amendments to shares and debentures, that's one of them. And quite a few, and there's some clarity needed on the MOI and when do you need to file the MOI if there's any changes on the memorandum of incorporation of a company. So there's quite a few that's changed, but we will only focus on what us, the BMF, and our mandate covers, and we won't be going through every amendment. So I'll just leave these on the line up here for anyone who wants to read them through. Okay. So you can see it's about 16 amendments, including the Social and Ethics Committee, and how do you make up that Social and Ethics Committee and what approvals do they need. So now we'll go straight through into the BMF perspective on the clauses or the amendments that we want to answer. And the reason we have a BMF outlook is because BMF has always been in the forefront on the struggle for empowerment of Black people in the workplace. BMF led the affirmative action debate in the 90s. BMF released an affirmative action blueprint in 1993, and a commission was set up by the state. And this also led to what is later known as the Basotho-Hat formula for affirmative action targets. BMF also played a role in further the Employment Equity Act, and that resulted in BMF being a key player at NEDLAC because of the inputs that we put in. And then BEE changed again to broad-based Black economic empowerment, and BMF again played a role in reshaping how a BEE is the landscape and the recommendations, and those got endorsed by government, and that's how come now we have a triple BEE policy. So we've played many parts also on JSE listing requirements that will continue then to inform the debate and bring a different thinking that's outside of big business, and that is why we're holding this engagement today with our members. So one of the discussion points I did not print the whole Companies Act, and I will not go through that because that'll be too hard and it'll take away time from discussions. So these are the ones that us and BMF felt that it's what we will cover and what we will go through with members today and get inputs. One of them is Section 45 of the Companies Act or the bill. And this one is that covers intercompany financial assistance. So it used to be very hard for companies, a holding company, to assist a smaller company. And you needed to go through a lot more and AGMs and adoption and that. So this bill now is that it's saying that a holding company does not have to go through so much and sign-offs for financial assistance of its own junior company. So the compliance burden has been cut down. And so it'll be easier for companies, especially now with companies trying to recover from the pandemic. It'll be much easier to give assistance, financial assistance to their companies. DP, is there anything that you would feel we need to add to on the Section 45 as the BMF?
No, I've got notes, so I'll just go through that. My main thing, Nonku, and good evening to everyone.
Good evening.
On the platform, is just to hone in, for me, on the Social and Ethics Committee. I think it's important from a BMF perspective and as an ordinary member to understand the power that the Social and Ethics Committee actually has, because it monitors the company's adherence to many legislative laws. So the Companies Act is one of the laws that the Social and Ethics Committee monitors whether the company is adhering to. So on 45, I think, the intercompany financial assistance is perhaps more in terms of ensuring transparency around loans between, because, it's not allowed to have share buybacks. Certain companies don't allow that. And I think, for me, it wouldn't be that important to add on to that specific section for now.
Okay, no, thank you, DP, for that. Okay, the next one we'll look at then is Section 26. And this section says that the members of the public could potentially be entitled to request copies of annual financial statements of private companies, non-profit companies, or personal liability companies. But they need to obviously show what interest they have in the company before they disclose that. So this, I can see big business having a problem with it, DP, because of maybe issues of what's confidential and what's not confidential. But also, with more transparency, it gives more responsibility, and that's the other debate, that open it up so people can act in an ethical way, because I know they're being watched. But yeah, there's issues there of privacy, of what do you want to share or not with competitors and other people. Section 30A requires SOEs and other companies to report on director pay, on remuneration, on who's the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee, and it looks at the wage ratio, which I know that executive pay has been an embarrassment, especially to companies like Woolworths. They've been in the paper, in the news now. The top 5 executives earned more than the whole of the company. So that's been an embarrassment for them. And I know that in response, Woolworths has increased the salaries of the lower paid employees. So for us in the BMF, we see pay and having remuneration as a tool for inequality, for addressing inequality, which you can't run away from anymore in the country. It's the gap between those who have and those who have not, it's definitely growing. And we also acknowledge that remuneration should be fair and responsible. So our initial stance when we saw this was that this is very acceptable for us. And we think that companies will be more responsible on executive pay, on how they handle that. big business definitely has an issue with this amendment. They feel like it will create things like a brain drain, retention of skills. But us as a BMF, we're saying those who want to change, who want to address inequality, those are the CEOs of the future that we want. Those who want to earn 16, 20 times more than the lowest paid employee, maybe that's not the skills and the leadership that the country requires. So we embrace this. So on this section, it's about pay. What is the ratio between the lowest paid and the highest paid employees? Right now, the Act does not push to say what it should be. It just says disclose. But I almost can guess that eventually it will go in and almost be a requirement to what those numbers should be. And yeah, it pushes for the remuneration policy to be shared with shareholders at the AGM and has to be approved. So that's a big one, and it's a big. We understand that we have seen globally as a shift towards more disclosure coming up. One of the sections again on section 30A is ownership disclosure. It's a requirement that companies needs to tell us who exactly is a shareholder. And if a deal includes multiple shareholders and multiple layers, it is now a requirement that those should be unveiled and people should be better transparency to see. Which, for us, Monde, it's an important point because we know we have corruption as a problem in the country. So this will certainly help, I think, to drive investment and to drive openness, because now we get to know who's involved in the deals, and the secrets are not that maintained through shadow and under companies and things like that. What we also wanted to touch on this point was gender and possibly color disparity on pay, which is a point that the Deputy President raised when we were talking about the bill, to say she would be much happier if it's not only the highest and the lowest paid employee, but what is the pay difference on the same job for a male and a female, and then drill further and between black and white pay. So that is section 30A. The next one that we would be interested in is section 56. And the reason, the duty of this section is to establish and maintain a register of disclosures to publish on annual financial statements as to who again holds interest in the company. So the quest of this is to disclose and pierce through the veil of who actually controls and who owns who. So some people I know to run away from this. Some deals are structured in the way of shelf companies or front companies and complex layers of ownership. So these also need to be disclosed. And like the previous section, this now pushes even through to say these needs to be approved. This will lead to more exposure. If there's any high profile people involved, politically exposed people involved in deals and how they benefit. This again, we feel will help with the issue of corruption. So we definitely approve, and we think that this will help as well to unmask where some certain deals are masked as a triple BEE deal, but actually it's not. So now we can see true beneficiaries because now they will be disclosed. And the concealment of interest from other shareholders, then it's will be dealt with, which for us it's a good point because it promotes the way it's hidden now. It promotes money laundering and funding of other criminal activities like terrorism and such. So that's our stance on it, and we're quite keen to hear what our members think of it. The last one that we wanted to touch on is the Social and Ethics Committee, and that one is section 72. I think this will give to we'll ask Deputy President just to help us understand for those who don't, what is the Social and Ethics Committee and what is the requirements and why we feel that it's an important amendment. Over to you, DP.
Thanks, Nonku. Thank you so much. So for those who haven't guessed, am I on? I can't seem to find myself on the screen. Okay, I can't see myself, which is let me just have a look at view options. Let's see. I still can't. But are you guys able to see me?
Yes, we can see you.
We can
Great
see you.
stuff. I'm not sure
And
I
the
can't
cat
see
left.
myself. Yeah, this is partly why I wanted to see myself, but in any event. So good afternoon, early evening to the members of the BMF and the friends of the BMF and all of those who are aspiring to become members of the BMF. And also to you, Nonku, Monde, and Itu for being here this evening and giving up with your valuable time. I think the most important thing to note on the Companies Amendment Act for those who have been in the company space, you'll remember that the Companies Act replaced, sort of became a national framework within which companies were going to operate, and it was a model adopted from DTI going to Canada and the UK and looking at their models and coming back and saying, well, as South Africans, we actually just want one system that regulates an entity and basically do away with close cooperation. So you'll note that if you currently have a close corporation, there is a transitional phase where the Close Corporations Act will cease to exist simply because they're not, CIPC, formerly known as CIPRO, is no longer forming close corporations. So if you have an existing one, I think you can, you can change members, but you can't form new close corporations. And that is because we wanted a unified system in which, framework for all entities that are not sole proprietors and partnerships to operate. So that gives you more certainty, and case law will be more consistent as we move along. So, I mean, the Companies Act is one that is quite old. I mean, it's 2008, it commenced May 2011, so it's now 2021. And I think it goes back to the point that you were making initially, Nonku, to say that this is how legislation happens in South Africa. It's a slow moving vehicle. It doesn't happen overnight. It's partly why, issues such as land ownership has not yet been finalized in this country. It also becomes very topical during election years, for the ruling party. And also, the procurement bill has also still not been enacted and come into force, which we've also made input in. And I just want to say, from a policy perspective, I was personally involved with the national minimum wage under the BBC umbrella. So it was BUSA and BBC who had a seat at NEDLAC. And in the negotiation for national minimum wage, there were arguments raised by BUSA basically to say that, disinvestment was going to happen large scale, that, it wasn't going to facilitate a growing economy. Part of the argument that we had as BMF was that there was no empirical data to support that view. And I think, as legislation sort of evolves, it's important that as BMF, we maintain our view, however ideological it may be, because what we want to do is see grander and greater participation in the Black participation in the economy. I mean, it's rather absurd that we are still battling with issues of racism and issues of advancing, Black managers, and the fact that if we look at reports like the Commission on Employment Equity that gets released by the Department of Labor annually in October, usually, we see that there's still this trap of a huge portion of Black managers occupying middle management. So you're not seeing a growth in terms, in a majority Black country, you're not seeing a growth of Black managers on senior level in terms of occupying spaces within boards. And then on executive levels, you're not seeing a huge proportion in relation to who is meant to own the economy and who is meant to participate in the economy. So I think it's quite important that we are quite firm in terms of what we would like to see. Whether or not we actually get that is obviously a different story, but that shouldn't make us not try hard to get there. So I think at the cusp of it, and as I was listening to you, Nonku, what you're basically saying and what I was hearing you say, and the conversation around the welcoming of these amendments is really, it's for BMF, it's about transformation, obviously, and advancing, a more society that is transformed in that regard. But I think also, and something that we can't ignore is that there is so much corruption. And that despite the Zondo Commission, we haven't seen on any level, and I'm saying municipal in particular, we haven't seen a real kind of shift in the lessening of corruption. If anything, corruption seems to have become bolder and seem to have grown. Currently, for example, today, early at the office, we had load shedding in the area where my office is, and then I came home and there was load shedding where I live. And those issues are issues where, SOCs, which are governed by the Companies Act, are equally mismanaged. It may not always be an issue of money. I think it's important that we denote management as the core to why we have a failing airline, why we don't have South African Airways flying, why Mango failed dismally, why there's talk about Transnet being the next Eskom. These are important issues, and I think from a BMF perspective, what the amendments seek to achieve is to disclose the real owners of companies and not to hide the identities. And the backdrop to that is because we have issues with and I'm not going to mention names, but the fact that ministers are able to have their family members' companies as tenders, the way they mask that. So when you actually go into why ministers and people complicit in corruption are not prosecuted, it's because you are unable to follow the money. And if you're unable to follow the money, then it's very difficult to prove political corruption, money laundering, terrorist financing, for example. And I think for that reason alone, we should welcome the newly published amendment bill, because it's going to offer to me, a game-changing overall in terms of transparency. So the bottom line for me is transparency. There's a number of changes. If I look at the notes that Nonku and I discussed, the top of it would be providing definition of true owner. And I've already said we need to know that fronting is not happening in a South African context, in a BMF context. The naming of directors and prescribed officers. So prescribed officers are people who are not, they're top management. So they don't occupy a space as an executive or non-executive director, but they are prescribed officers in terms of the management of the company. So now there needs to be a disclosure in terms of their remuneration and benefits. So, if you look at the kind of amendments that we're talking about, it's very transparent. One of it is extending definition of an employee share scheme to include situations where there are purchases of shares of a company. So again, this is really fundamental principles around transforming and including Black participation in the economy. I'm going to zone in on the 4 main points because I am mindful of time and the fact that we want to have a bit of an engagement around these issues. So if we look at section 45, it places, so currently it talks to what Nonku was saying. It places an admin burden on the holding company to provide information on the inter-company financial assistance that's provided. And from a BMFI and BMF stance, we need to see the flow of shareholders' interest and ensure that there's oversight. Currently, under the Companies Act, a holding company that does grant financial assistance to a subsidiary must first obtain prescribed approvals from the board in any event, failing which that loan would be void. And then it sets out the specific instances. So what the bill seeks to amend is that the requirements, it becomes very difficult to do that, as important as it is. And then it just basically says that the new proposal, because obviously one must understand that DTI has been, even, I mean, for the amount of time that's passed, there have been interaction with civil society and private business on the amendments to the, in fact, in 2008 already, if you look at the amendments, they're similar to when DTI called or when comments were open to make input into the Companies Act. So a lot of that has been taken forward. So these are not, I mean, the fact that it was released on the 1st of October and we have to make input by 31st of October, I think denies the fact that there was a previous round where, you know, everybody was given an opportunity to make input. And based on that input, I mean, it is a bit late to wake up, but I think that in trying to combat corruption and to combat fronting and to combat the various ills that SOCs and listed companies face, government was kind of under pressure to ensure that this legislation actually sees the light of day sooner rather than later. So basically 45 is just in terms of deal flow and how companies would then grant subsidiary funding. Well, how holding companies would rather provide subsidy grants and financial assistance. And then section 26, Nonku's already spoken about. And I think there, you know, our input is going to be disclosure, you know, in terms of financial statements, and how, you know, that will impact if your competitors are not able to obtain your annual financial statements. And I mean, there again, there are exemptions in terms of the PIC scoring. And so I think that like with, you know, with all socio-economic legislation, the people that it aims to protect usually will be protected, and sort of like the bigger companies will then be liable to give that information. And quite interestingly enough, there's also what section 26 will then do is you know, is extend criminal liability in an instance where directors and prescribed officers fail to accommodate any reasonable request. Which is quite important, because then it really, I mean, everybody wants to be directors, but nobody really one understands or accepts and fully appreciates the burden and fiduciary responsibilities that go with being a director. So it's quite important to note that you know, if you have executive directors that are running the company that are doing things that you are not aware of, because essentially non-executive directors don't run a company. It's corporate malfeasance for non-executive directors to interfere in the day-to-day operation of a company. So ordinarily, the board of ABSA, for example, is not going to be telling the CEO of ABSA how to do his job, but they would be liable if the CEO of ABSA, for example, was doing things that they may not know about, but they ought to have known about simply because they're non-executive directors. So the, you know, the actions of an executive director can still bind non-executive directors. So it's quite important that if those executive directors are then not making those requests accessible, or at least show that they've taken reasonable steps to ensure compliance, then it's going to be a problem for all directors, because there may be that criminal liability extension. So that's quite important. Section 30 requires public and state-owned companies to publish the annual financial statements, reports, details about directors. I don't think the BMF or the BMF ought not to have an issue with that particular section. Like Nonku said, for me, it's not just about reporting on the highest paid versus the lowest paid. And I do know that there's a resistance from business to say, well, you know, this doesn't create an environment that is conducive to you know, to one where companies are going to want to invest because now they need to declare. I mean, the declaration in itself is exactly what Nonku was talking about. If you look at Woolworths, I mean, it's actually quite disturbing to note that you can have, and it's not just entities like Woolworths, by the way, Nonku. I mean, that's just the latest. But I mean, if you look at Capitec and a lot of the big banks, what their CEOs earn for a bonus, It's actually, I mean, that amount of money, I don't know if you're able to spend it in your lifetime. And then you look at the huge inequality gap that, you know, exists in a country like South Africa. So for me, what our input as BMF should be is to endorse that that there be this disclosure on the pay disparities. I think specifically in terms of SOCs, those are SOCs are our companies, you know, the shareholders are South Africans, it's us, the citizens, the taxpayers. Even if you're not a taxpayer, you are a South African citizen. So you're entitled to information and to ensure that state-owned entities are actually being run with your best interests at heart. And if it's not the case, that you really hold government accountable. And I think in that regard, we are not holding government accountable. You know, there's no real forum. And I think that's maybe something we must look at in terms of how you hold government ministers accountable, because we have this 3-tier system of you know, municipal, then we've got provincial, and then we've got national, and national can't really interfere on a municipal level. So you have layers of corruption, and national, you know, who's supposed to be the oversight, actually stand back and they cross their arms and say, well, actually, we can't touch you. And municipalities, you know, mayors and DGs, and they know this. So it creates an environment where you're kind of untouchable to a large degree. So I think in terms of SOC specifically, BMF endorses that there must be full transparency. I'm not sure why public companies who use black labor at very cheap prices and then have shareholders as well can't have an equal responsibility to report. I think the idea or notion that a company is a private entity and you can do what you want no longer exists in a South African context, specifically when we see Steinhoff basically destroying pensions of thousands, hundreds of thousands of South Africans. And this is important. PIC had a stake there, and PIC is, you know, government employee pension fund. So in that context, companies become the social structure, whether they're private, whether they, you know, SOCs, whether they're listed, they need to account. So for me, it would be to say, let them disclose if there are issues as we go along, because remember the sections are there, they may not be fully clear, but then regulations will be enacted to say how they're going to happen. I can't see that disclosure is going to specifically, for an example, you know, be a mechanism that companies are no longer going to find it competitive to do business in South Africa. Certainly not. So what it then begs the question, why the resistance? Why are they not willing to make these disclosures as is required in an environment where private companies are also as easily susceptible to corruption as state-owned companies? And if you look at the implications of the kind of professionals and the companies, Bell Pottinger, you know, big auditing firms, law firms, these were all professional vessels through which corruption occurred in this country. So you're not dealing with people who didn't know what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. And I think it's important that we then place this huge burden on private companies to also disclose. It just creates transparency. It creates an environment where corruption is not fertile to thrive. So I think that, you know, to me, that is quite important. And then to add on to that, Nonku, like you said, I felt strongly that there's a raging debate within gender pay disparity between males and females. There's a raging debate around the fact that we know as Black people, white people get paid more than us. It's you know, and this is not based on merit. It's not based on the fact that they're better at their job or they have better qualifications. It's purely based on, you know, whoever hires them feels this is their salary, you know, with HR. So with that, having said that, we need to ask, we need to incorporate it into as many forms of legislation that we can, to say that in addition to the highest versus lowest, we need to look at why, you know, or if it is in fact a fact that we can empirically prove, to say that this suspicion that we have that Black people are being paid less than their white counterparts, you know, we need to know for sure. there needs to be a revelation in regards to that. And then obviously, you know what, I mean, there is empirical data on the fact, for example, if you look at just casual workers, so women earn 37% less doing casual work than male. And I mean, there's no plausible rational reason for that. There's just nothing that speaks to why that is the case. Section 56, Nonku, you've spoken about beneficial ownership, interest and true ownership. And I think we will support that simply because as BMF, we are saying we do definitely want an environment where there is no fronting in companies. And we've seen a lot of that despite the BE Commission, you know, whistleblowing. It's just difficult to monitor. And then I think, you know, let me just close off by referring to Section 72, read with Regulation 43, and that speaks to the appointment of a social and ethics committee. I think it's very important that members are made aware that if you want to transform from a strategic level, the social and ethics committee will make the transformation strategy. They'll present the report on a transformation strategy linked to a budget to the board, and the board will then approve it. What the company's amendment bill aims to do is to take it a step further and say, well, we're now going to take the social and ethics committee report to an annual general meeting. Whereas before it was just, there was no real, so companies who didn't want to embrace transformation didn't have to do this. They didn't have to include the social and ethics committee report as part of the annual report. It wasn't a must. The fact that it now needs to happen at an AGM level with shareholders tells me that there's an elevation. So we certainly support that. If you look at a transformation strategy and even the terms of reference of a social and ethics committee, it speaks to the monitoring of various legislation, including the Companies Act. It speaks to you know, adhering to the 10 principles of the United Nations Global Compact principles. It talks about the recommendations regarding corruption in the Organization for Economic, Cooperative and Development, which is an international organization. So if the company subscribes to those principles, already that speaks to you know, issues of corruption, speaks to, so the social and ethics terms of reference will then say what the company must monitor. And it's usually a very long list of legislation, and it'll be the basic conditions of employment, it'll be the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, compensation for occupational health, for occupational injuries and diseases Act. So it's a whole host, Consumer Protection Act, Competition Act, FICE, POPIA, Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination. It's a whole host, value-added tax, unemployment insurance. All of these things are being monitored by the Social and Ethics Committee. So companies, so obviously in terms of the amendment, it doesn't change currently who must form. So JSE listed companies and SOCs must have social and ethics committees. They must. And it's quite interesting to note that usually the social and ethics committee is relegated to the orphan. It's the orphan committee of every single organization that I've come across, simply because people think social and ethics is about painting a creche. They think it's about 67 minutes on Mandela Day for some odd reason. They do understand that they need to comply with their BE level if they want to do business, you know, so that's a marketing thing for them. So they do it for the wrong reasons, Nonku. I'm not saying we must monitor people's reasons, but it becomes a tick box exercise. It's more about compliance than it is about embracing, you know, true values of living in a transformed society that addresses the injustices of the past. And I mean, I think that's the future we want to see. And certainly in a country where, you know, 10% of the population owns 90% of the economy. And I think if you understand that we are the economic minority in this country, you will then understand why we actually have these, you know, legislative protection in a, I mean, it's bizarre because if you look at a place like America, where white people are the majority, you have affirmative action for minorities like African Americans, Hispanic people, Native Americans. You don't have Black economic empowerment principles for the majority of the country. But I think in the South African context, we must remind ourselves that we remain the economic minority. And I mean, that's a chapter on its own. We haven't even touched on issues like the sovereign wealth fund. If we had a sovereign wealth fund, we would be able to loan money from the government. We haven't spoken about reparations for apartheid. I mean, if you look at the Holocaust and how the Germans, paid and made reparations to Jewish people who suffered, and generations who came after, there were reparations for the Jews. And so we haven't even touched on those principles. What I'm trying to say with the Social and Ethics Committee, it's a committee that can really advance change. It's a committee that will allow Black participation. If you look at, and not these bogus, staff and employee schemes where you have trusts formed, and then there's what they do is they'll blow up the expenses, so there's never dividend in the whole lifetime of that employee until they work until they're 60. They don't actually see a flow, but you get points for that B level. And these are just the practical reasons and the practical rationale for these amendments, because I think that DTI understands through the BE Commission, through civic society. It's not just BMF. There are many other organizations that want to see transformation, and they want to see an equitable distribution of wealth in this country. And the Companies Amendment Bill is just one of the legislative sort of access points through which we will see real and impactful change. So for me, the Social and Ethics Committee, currently you must publish the fact that you want to be exempted. It's not any different from what it currently is, because you can also still apply to the tribunal for exemption from having a Social and Ethics Committee. So you can apply for that, but I mean, the tribunal will look at why you want to be exempted and possibly decline that exemption. So I'm not too concerned about that. My main thing is for, when we look at what's been happening and I'm going to round off now, if we look at what's been happening at places, and again, I feel bad for mentioning names, but if we look, because we were personally involved with this one, if you look at ABSA, for example, and the fact that they are one of the, they're one of the banks that can't actually keep CEOs, Maria Ramos left like abruptly. We had a meeting with her in October, and by the budget speech, her announcement came out that she was, retiring in air quotes. The last one, Daniel Namela, who was also, left in air quotes again, ABSA. If there was an active social and ethics committee that spoke to succession planning, which the transformation strategy will speak to, they will ensure a pipeline of Black managers that can take over. There should at least be, at any given point, 5 people being lined up for a CEO position. So when Daniel left, there was this vacuum created like previously in ABSA. And I was saying, I find it very difficult to believe that ABSA would have a transformation strategy, or an active one, or one that the board takes seriously, or one that the executives are actually implementing, because transformation doesn't happen from the shop floor upward. It trickles down. So if the board is not transformative in its approach, if the board is not pro-Black and anti-poor, then you're not going to see executives implementing, because middle management just get told what to do. If you sit as a middle manager, you have absolutely no say in the direction that the company is taking. So I think it's quite important that when we ask companies questions on transformation, one of the questions that we must ask them is, do they have a transformation strategy? Do they have a transformation plan that they can share with us? Confidentially, of course. I mean, we don't have to make it, advertise it in the newspaper, but it's important to understand that there's an active social and ethics committee. Otherwise, transformation, I mean, if you have a committee that ensures adherence to global standards of corruption, that adheres to safety and security of employees, that adheres to Black economic empowerment, to ensure that there's participation, that we see the flow of deals for employees who are Black, and then also for civil society. I mean, this is why we don't see BE deals. It's because social and ethics committees are not functioning the way they should be. It's now easy to get a level 1, even if your board is totally white. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever seen, but it happens. So for me, Nonku, we're going to be just to let the members know, we've got our head of policy, Monde, that's on this platform, yourself as well. We've got we do have a PRC, Policy Research Committee. These inputs will be sent to them as well. We will be making input where we expand on, on issues of not just gender paid, or rather highest paid versus lower paid disclosure, where we ask that the bill extends that to the gender pay gap, and then also extends that to the racial pay gap. So we will be making those input, and hopefully we will see the fruits that we've seen with the national minimum wage, which was enacted, we worked on it in 2015, it was enacted in January 2020. So I think that there is pressure on government to ensure that the Companies Act after 10 years is aligned to what we want to see happening. And so we should see a lot of what's been proposed here probably and possibly come to the fore, and sooner rather than later. So I'm going to hand back over to you and thank everyone for joining and for their time.
Thank you, DP. Your inputs were extensive and very knowledgeable. I think now we've definitely taken lots of notes on what you spoke, but it's also important to hear from our members. We've got a few provincial secretaries who joined us. We also have Babukeza Koza, who's our chairperson on policy and research, and it'd be good to also hear from him and let him speak to the members. Monde, I'm not sure if you've got any questions on the line, or how would you like to handle the discussion side?
Yeah, I think the members should post their thoughts and their reflections on some of the points mentioned by yourself and DP, so that we can have a look at them. I think maybe very briefly, just to refresh some of those key points, Nonku, that you made, just in case someone came in a bit late, did not catch some of the earlier points. Just a brief point of discussion there that you had on that slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's which slide, Monde? The
So
one on.
Yeah, the one before the, yeah, there we go. Just very briefly on some of those points, section 45 that you mentioned, 26, section 30A.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, just so that just refresh a little bit, and then hopefully the colleagues can ask some questions or make input. They don't have to ask questions, by the way. They can also make input on what they've heard, on if they have had an opportunity to actually go through some of the amendments themselves in their spare time, and they wanted to add other points that have not been covered here as well. Of course, they should add. Yeah, so that's my suggestion for now.
Okay, sure. I'll go through it quickly.
Thanks.
I understand. Okay. So for those who joined later, there's about 16 amendments to the Companies Act. Us as a BMF chose about 5 or 6 that we think we can speak to based on our mandate. And one of them is section 45, which deals with intercompany financial transfers. So it repeals a section 45 in the Act, which required that financial assistance from a holding company to a junior company requires a special resolution and maybe a special AGM, and different test solvency and liquidity tests that needed to take place. So that's what it's repealing. So what the bill seeks to amend is to reduce the compliance burden that companies could now help a senior company could help a junior company, or a holding company could assist a junior company and help with financial flow, and it doesn't have to go through all of these legal hoops. So, but though if a junior company was to assist the holding company, though the hoops do apply on the tests, the solvency liquidity tests, and maybe a special adoption of a resolution. So what we said as a BMF on that, and which the Deputy President also said, was it's very important that the flow of monies is still open to shareholder oversight and interest. But we said we're still happy with that, and we feel that it's in line with how the future of business is going forward now, with companies needing to recover from the pandemic. Section 26 is on disclosures, on companies needing to disclose their financials, which says that members of the public could request copies of annual financial statements of private companies, NPOs, and personal liability companies. And this is a bit uncertain now. We know big business has made a big noise about it, to say they feel that their competitors should know their financial standing. So that's section 26. So we understand that it could be a concern to some private companies as a BMF, but we also say that more disclosure leads to more accountability. Section 30A, which we also looked at, it's looking at a few things. It says that it requires that companies need to provide a remuneration policy and disclose the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid employee. DP gave us her wisdom on that, to say that she would go even further and say that we need to look at gender and racial parity in pay. And
no, if I can just interject. So I am chair of a social and ethics committee of a company. It's not a listed company, but they do score above the 500 PI. So there I've specifically asked HR to disclose what they're paying, you know, in terms of the racial profile of the executives. I've asked for that information, which they've given, and they'd have to explain why there was and it could also be that people are there so long, so their salaries, you know, they get annual increases, and that's the reason, which is understandable. But then when new people come in, it's just got to be market aligned. And then as the chair of SEC and as a committee, we agreed that we also wanted to know the gender pay gap. So I'm saying that using social and ethics committees as a tool to just make the board, and now that it goes to AGM level, telling shareholders, you know, do you know this company pays, you know, white people more than black people, they pay men more than women. You know, that to me would go a long way in terms of the direction. You don't want to be embarrassed as a board, you know, on that issue. So I think there's a lot of power in, and it's stagnant if you're not going to use it. So you need to, you know, it's a tool that you need to know how to use. And once you know, you'll see it unlocking things and closing down. I mean, social and ethics also talks about whistleblowing, about charging employees criminally for having engaged in corruption. So just, you know, I can't stress this point enough. So sorry for the interjection. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. No, that helped a lot. And I think it's just the point on the Social and Ethics Committee. So that's what we covered for those who just joined. On what the bill now does is it elevates Social and Ethics Committee and says that companies have to make sure that the Social and Ethics report gets adopted at the AGM on a majority basis. And should the majority of shareholders not adopt it, they have 4 months to engage with those shareholders to do amendments. So it's very serious, and it's elevated. And what DP is saying is that we definitely welcome it, and we wanted to go a step further, because it'll address issues of fronting, will address issues, like she says, of whistleblowing, which we need in a country of that's so rife with corruption. So Monday, those are the BMF discussion points that we felt that are important. So there was a recap.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any questions coming through, or any comments. Of course, if it's understood, then it's understood. You know, you don't want to keep digging if members are aligned. There was an interesting question earlier, and I'm not sure if DP you want to have a look at that question on the chat there, directed at you know, the BMF about, you know, disclosing in terms of office bearers. Let me just go back to the quickly. In terms of disclosing conflicts of interest when they come into office? How do you make sure that office bearers are not lobbied by external people? I'm putting to my own words now, but how do you make sure that they're not lobbied by external people to make particular decisions within the BMF and push certain things within the BMF? So I think that's an interesting question around governance there.
Yeah, I think also, you know, Mondi, what that speaks to me, without going into particular, I mean, I read the chat, I read the comment on the chat. And I think it speaks to the ethos and the Basotho hat, which we're celebrating this year specifically around the kind of member that we want. And the kind of ethical, it's quite anomalous to speak about ethical leadership, because implicit in the word leadership is ethics. You can't be a leader without being ethical. But we've seen from a political sphere, especially, that we do have people that are in leadership positions who are not ethical and who are there to push for their own financial interests. So it's like asking, you know, how do we prevent corruption? And I think the only way to do it is to expose it. So if there is a BMF member who is conflicted, I mean, these BMF office bearers must be outed. We need to, you know, we need to share this information, as long as the information is accurate, that it doesn't seek to defame, and that it's going to take, you know, what we as a BMF are about forward. We really, you know, we also need to, there's a fine line between, and I often say this, you know, you look at white people and they kind of fight, you know, dirty they don't air their dirty laundry. Whereas, you know, when we have a fight, it's you know, it finds itself in all kinds of forums. So there's a fine line between that and being, you know, not following proper governance rules and things that can actually get you behind bars. It's quite important that when we do these things, that we expose for reasons that are not also self-serving and spiteful, but that's going to take the organization forward, and the brand that the BMF as a 45-year-old organization is not tainted by the conduct of individual members, and we need to distance ourselves from those office bearers. I don't really know how we're going to properly ensure that it doesn't happen, but I think the more BMF people or members know that while they're carrying the BMF flag, they're not going to fly it high. We don't have space for them. And that's not going to be sustainable. But once we create an environment where people are allowed to thrive and where people get away with unethical conduct, it then becomes problematic, because our silence then almost endorses the position. And inevitably, we almost become part of that corruption. And I see the member says, or the person says, and that's what, you know, what makes him lose faith in the BMF. And I think it's a wider conversation. It makes people not want to vote on the 1st of November. It makes people lose faith in, you know, the future of this country. It makes people want to leave. It's that kind of conversation, because there's a lack of ethics. And I think we just need to build on that. We need to have sessions where we educate our members. We have to have sessions where we're constantly reminding office bearers that, you know, as a membership-based organization, they account to their constituency, they account to their members on a provincial basis, they account to their members on a branch level basis, and as national leaders on the board, we account to everyone. So we must just be accountable, we must be transparent, and we must be for good corporate governance. I hope that answers that question partially, at least.
Thanks, DP. I see the chair of the PRC, Mr. Khoza, has got his hand up.
Oh, great, let's bring him in. Let's bring Rapay in.
Itu, can you assist us in bringing Mr. Khoza on the platform there? There we go. Chair, you can unmute. There we go.
Yeah, no, good evening, leaders and President-elect Boya Benyat, as well as Nonku. I've been listening, and thanks for, you know, making arrangements, you know, Monday, that we should have a discussion around this. And maybe it comes at a very important time in the BMF's life. I don't know to what an extent. I know at some stage we say in our MOI, the Companies Act doesn't necessarily apply. I don't know to what an extent can we sponsor a resolution that in as much as we're an NPC, we would make sure that we at least have this social and ethics committee. I see it being very pivotal for BMF, and this is not a new thing. I mean, those of who know me, they know I like the subject of ethics, and I'd said at some stage, BMF, propagates itself as this organization that promotes ethics. And I said, lo and behold, at some stage, we could be found wanting if a Kaiser Khoza could serve in ESCOM or Transnet. And you find that I put my own hand in a cookie jar and being a very known member of the BMF. So I would want us to not take this issue of ethics for granted and think that by virtue of paying 746, you are automatically ethical, because then, we may embarrass the organization at some stage. And we've had few incidences in the past where our own leaders got to embarrass us. So I would want maybe us to ponder, the BMF members who are here, who are delegates and who serve in other branches, that whether we cannot sponsor that, we should start having this committee. So that this committee assists us in a number of issues that we believe are confronting BMF, either at branch, at province, or national at some stage, amongst directors themselves. So that we make sure that, one, we teach ethics. We don't take it for granted that all of us who have joined BMF are all of a sudden ethical, because BMF is like a broad church. Being a professional organization, not all of us are professionals, and I'm saying this not lightly. Professionals in a sense that we are registered with a particular professional body. We have sat in an exam and we're tested on ethics, right? So it's something that I would want us to think of and sponsor. And of course, this amendment is key because it does introduce the definition of triple B, as well as the commission in its definition. And what is key for me, and I know NEDLEC discussion might have ended at 5% because we were starting. I would want us to look at other countries that have said even a 1% shareholding, is important. We need to be open and transparent about who are these shareholders. And I'll cite you an example. If you could Google now BMF shareholding in different companies, you're not going to find it, because it is hidden in some special purpose vehicle, right? So I'm happy that this openness and transparency is going to uplift that and unseal this corporate veil, as it were, to make sure that we get to know, because we know financial illicit flows of money and other things, racketeering have been, and I hear DP, you spoke about that even during the so-called state capture in South Africa. And this has been happening for some time because these shareholders are hidden in these special purpose vehicles. And I'm happy 5% is a start, but I would want it to go to 1%. Because once you keep it 5%, then people are going to take 4.9% in different companies. And you are not going to be in the position to, pierce the corporate veil and get to know who are the shareholders behind a particular company. But thanks, and thanks once more for this discussion. And, I hope members have joined in, and we are going to make our own input into this bill before the closing of the deadline. And thanks once more, colleagues. Good evening.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Because is there anything that you wanted to add, DP, after Mr. Khoza?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that as the BMF, we definitely, as a non-profit company, like I said, it's closed corporations that are dying out. They're not, SIPC's not allowing new registration. So SOCs, private companies, listed companies, non-profit companies, which BMF is one of, and we may not be forced to form a social and ethics committee. But I think that we should consider it. And not to make all of these committees, duplicate. We could even, so for me, social and ethics, if we're not going to have issues around sexual harassment policies, if we're not going to have whistleblowing, if we're not going to have, verification of membership, I think is quite an important one. If we say that we are here to advance Black managers, how do we define a Black manager? It's something that I think we grappled with in the past. And I've personally been, as company secretary, in 2010 with Ntati Manyi, I've been under a few AGMs and it's where it's a triennial AGM where people are voting. There's a lot of buying of membership. I don't want to lie to you. And one of, in the past it's been, but who are these members? Are they legitimate BMF managers? I know in the old days when I served on Manco with people like Glenn Zamisa and Butkaya, we as Manco would sit and look at applications. It wasn't a money-making thing. We were not there to grow the membership to 1 million. It was just about vetting members to say this member qualifies. Now, I mean, you could actually legitimately be a domestic worker. No, I'm not, no offense to people who are in that trade. And you could apply and pay 747 and you could become a member. Nobody checks. And that to me is something that the social and ethics, I know that there's a verification that we normally have on membership, but I don't know how far that verification goes. Do we actually call people and we call institutions and say, we live in a society where people have fake qualifications. It's a real thing. There's been massive embarrassments on ministerial levels and vice chancellor and chancellor levels where people don't have the qualifications that they say they have. So I think that is important, that we go back to basics, that we don't become over ambitious in terms of, we have the right members. We have members that are going to take the flag of BMF, that speak to the ethos of BMF. So there won't be a burden in terms of disciplining members who are, and people are going to be properly inducted. I think a lot of times we want to punish people because they don't know. And it's not just, go and read the MOI. It's an indictment of us as leadership of branches, provinces, and at national to delegate to members to say they must go and read. Induction is the core of what makes people unhappy because they don't understand. Their why is not clarified. So that social and ethics committee, I want to sponsor that view without going into too much detail for the reasons that I've stated before. We've seen this. If you've been a long-standing member of the BMF, none of what I've said is brand new. And I'm not pointing fingers or blaming anyone or targeting anyone in this comment. I'm just saying, let us learn from the past and make the BMF a better space. And take the agenda of Black managers so that we have, when government comes to us and says to us, who can be the next CEO of XYZ Bank? We've got people groomed. We've got people that have served on boards, and that that there's quality members that we know if we send them, they're going to be ethical. We know that they're going to do the right thing. We know that they're going to excel in what they're doing, and that they're going to be built to succeed. So I think for me, that's an important issue that we perhaps can encapsulate under social and ethics if we have a committee like that will deal with induction, that will deal with membership training, that will deal with, how do we get scholarships overseas? How do we, we work with sister organizations? How do we fit under the BBC umbrella? How do we make input into NEDLAC? A whole host of things that comes to my mind now that I think about what Brakeza raised, and all legitimate. Thank you so much for just jogging that creative process. So yeah, that's my input. It's a lot, I know, but thanks.
Monday, is there anything else that we need to cover? For closing remarks?
No, I think we're okay. I see there's a comment that has come in.
Okay.
There's an interesting question, by the way, before I read the comment. Do we also have a step aside rule? If not, why? Yeah, look, DP, you can answer that. Of course, we don't want to go down a particular road here. But I think just to give the question a response, just a brief response on that. But you did allude to, certain grievance processes that the BMF does have, which are covered in the MOI, at branch level, provincial level, even at board level, which are covered in the MOI, if there's a particular issue with a particular leader or office bearer. So, yeah. Yes, DP?
Yeah, I mean, the step aside rule came to the fore under the ANC banner. And, I think we must guard ourselves against, setting our standards against that of any political party. We, like Kaiser said, we're a broad church. Our membership is, we're non-racial, we're non-partisan. So our members are from all parties. That step aside rule, I mean, if you have a code of, we don't have one. Why don't we have one? We rely on members because it's a voluntary organization to do the right thing. If you uphold the values of the BMF, step aside rules won't come to the fore. And perhaps because they have come to the fore, regardless of us saying we live in this utopian BMF where everybody must do the right thing, but we see people don't do the right thing. We can engage on that issue at a social and ethics committee level. I know that a lot of what BMF does is mirrored on the ANC. I know in one of the board meetings, I know that the ANC had some committee also closely linked to social and ethics or anti-corruption or something, and we also then wanted to follow suit and have a committee of that kind where we deal specifically with incidences of corporate malfeasance and corruption. So, yeah, why don't we have a rule? People must go to AGM and they must propose through their branches resolutions that what they want to see in the MOI. The MOI, along with the Companies Act. So if there's a conflict between the MOI and the Companies Act will prevail. So you can't avoid the Companies Act by doing something that's contrary to and say, well, the MOI says we can't do this, but the Companies Act allows it. So I think it's very important that we understand the framework under which BMF operates as a non-profit company. And if the Companies Act allows something that our MOI is silent on, that we are then allowed to follow the Companies Act. It's the same with for example, an employment contract. If you earn under a certain threshold, and I think it's about 297,000 per annum, basic conditions of employment will apply regardless of what your contract says. So your contract can say 5 days leave, but your basic conditions of employment act says 17 or 20 odd days. That's the amount of leave that, and the purpose of that is basically to protect vulnerable people in our society. So I see there's another one on Agri-BE. I'm not familiar with Agri-BE, and perhaps through this engagement, what we should do is look at the sectoral requirements of Black economic empowerment. I'm not, I don't know, Nonku, you also in that company secretarial commercial law space, are you able to answer the injustices? I don't doubt that there are injustices, but I'm not familiar with the Agri-BE sector code and section 56,
Okay, no, the agri sector I know recently met. They held a workshop as to how far we are with the gains in the sector. And the way I've been following it, it went down to financing models, and that's why participation is so low, because the industry is seasonal and funding doesn't really work in that way. But I think it'll be a good forum to hold, to understand the challenges there, and if we need to make any inputs in the changes of that sector in the discussion of those sector codes.
Absolutely. There's another comment. Equally, BMF must be just transparent. Of course, I mean, we fall under the Companies Act. We would be transparent regardless. I just don't know where you want this disclosure, because obviously salary is a line item And I mean, we also need to balance issues of privacy, in terms of how we disclose the information. It can't be recklessly done, but yeah. Highest and lowest, I mean, if you say the highest, you're going to assume it's a CEO, so ordinarily you're going to immediately know it is. I think we just need to engage better on that item, that doesn't degrade and make people feel undignified. I think for me, that's a guiding light in how we deal with these issues. As much as, NPC is, I mean, we get our funding from donor sponsors, so obviously we must account to them as well. We need to deal with the money responsibly.
Okay. I know my chairperson has made a note here. I'm not sure. Chairperson, would you like to join us live, perhaps? Just to explain your comment. Monday, will that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
As a word. Itu, are you able to add that?
Evening, colleague.
Evening.
Yes,
Hi.
I think my question came with my experience with the Companies Act, a section that pertains to business rescue practitioners. We would have seen what happened with SAA and several institutions that were put under business rescue, and the practice where you find the former liquidators are today the business rescue practitioners. And most of the companies that then go through business rescue never really gets to be saved, except that the practitioners walk away with money, which is usually what used to happen in liquidation. So probably what is the stance of the new amendments in that? And are we looking at transformation of that profession as well? Because obviously the Companies Act brought it to the fore as a profession. In the past, we know that the master of the court used to appoint liquidators, but the same liquidators now serve as business rescue practitioners. What is happening now, or is there a part where we can then influence this process in these amendments to then try and see if we can set up targets or differentiate between liquidators and business rescue people? Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, DP. Do you have a comment to that?
Yeah, just to say good evening, Mr. Betsy, chair on BMF. Mr. Betsy, it's quite interesting how we fight the transformation battle, because a few years ago, liquidators actually took the master's office to court to say that they were making it compulsory for liquidators to have a co-black appointment. When that was challenged in court, the court, and I think it was a Western Cape division, it's not a Concord decision, found that was actually unconstitutional, that you can't make laws of that nature. So again, transformation needs to be embraced and not a compliance issue, because the minute you get a court case that says you don't have to do that, it becomes cemented in the minds of white people to say they don't need to transform, and why are we making space for black liquidators. And I think it talks to the scarce skills gap. In terms of business rescue, I mean, my experience about business rescue practitioners is that SIPC, I mean, the creditor, the person who brings the application will put forward a name, and at the first creditors meeting, if the shareholders vote, then that person is either going to be outvoted or they bring their own person in, exactly like what happens in a liquidation situation. There's a creditors meeting where the liquidator's appointment is approved ultimately. But I think your question is more, is this, so yes, business rescue is a provision that came about in 2011. As a way to save companies, and you're 100% right. I couldn't agree with you more. It becomes an exercise in futility if you look at SAA. If you look at the amount of money that the business rescue practitioners get paid in relation to the debt of the company, and okay, fine, SAA was not liquidated. So normally what happens in companies, as Mr. Betsy said, is that the business rescue will land up in liquidation, which means the end of the company anyway. Then you've got your business rescue practitioner professional fees that you need to pay, and then at liquidation there's 10% that goes to the liquidator. Nonku, that amendment hasn't been, and obviously from a transformation perspective, it's not addressed in the company's amendment bill whatsoever. The provision on, so I mean, we could possibly, there are provisions. I don't know if you're restricted and to only comment on that, but nobody has raised this very valid point that Mutsabetsi is now raising. That is the limit of my understanding, and I hope I've answered you in part, Mutsabetsi, but you do have my cell phone number if you want to chat about this in detail.
Okay. No, definitely you're correct, and nothing stops us from adding more to it, just to flesh it out. I agree with you.
Okay. I don't know, you were trying to get Kaiser on the line, Monday. Are we still trying to get Kaiser to comment on something? I'm not sure.
He's still on the platform. If he still wants to add something, he's still on the platform. I see him.
So Kazi,
yeah, thanks, colleagues. I'm not a panelist here. Yeah, quick one to the amendments. I mean, having been involved in legislative drafting, it's going to be very difficult to bring new amendments. What often happens is that there are discussions prior to a department initiating a particular amendment. So as you'd know, the issue of percentage on openness and transparency of shareholders was a NEDLEC discussion, and that's why it said 5% above. To introduce something like that, you're going to have a war, and because it has not started as part of public participation, it becomes very difficult to introduce it even in Parliament. And I agree fully with what Sebetsi is saying. We've created more problems for ourselves. Nobody wants to go through business rescue because the only people who make money are those few, lily white people. The company that is supposed to be rescued ended up with nothing. Right. So it's something that needs to, you'd know with insolvency as well. Back then, DP, we had a similar problem. You'd even know the famous court case of that insolvency when Department of Justice was trying to bring transformation in that space. Right. So I am happy that we're having this discussion and maybe because Monde said this is policy. Yes, it's policy, but we equally maybe moving forward needs to broaden the scope of the litigation fund to be litigation stroke legislative drafting. Because you see, if it just becomes litigation, it puts so much work on one committee to interpret legislative drafting as policy and research, right? There's a symbiotic relationship, but it's something that we may want to think of, because naturally the litigation fund is constituted of lawyers. Any legislative drafting is policy, but at the end of the day is about a draft law, which is called a bill. So you may want to have that close relationship. So whoever takes over leadership post the 19th of November, some of us would have retired. These are some of the inputs that we are giving you that try to create that balance between the PRC and litigation fund stroke legislative drafting, because otherwise it becomes too cumbersome. There are so many bills that are being amended now affecting quite a whole lot of transformation space issues. You might have heard, you may take this lightly and think it doesn't affect us. The issue of the trucking, which had blockaded the roads. That's the economy of a country, right? And look at what people are complaining about. They are saying, is it a skill to employ a truck driver that the employers would seek to employ undocumented immigrants to be the ones who are driving the truck, to the detriment of South African drivers? So these are some of the conversations we're supposed to be having, because that is what Department of Labor under the Employment Services Act is supposed to have done in terms of the regulations. So many countries in Africa have done that. So I'm just setting an example of what is happening around our space, which talks to the issues of economic development, which is our terrain, right? But at a very low level, because when you see it in the news, you're like, oh, these truck drivers, they don't know what they're talking about. But they're raising a genuine question, because you wouldn't find that happening anywhere in any of the European countries. There's just a clear, ratio to say these jobs are reserved for locals. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing xenophobic about it. So these are the conversations I guess we should be having. And I'm very thankful to Monde, because he has started, that we should have this conversation under advocacy. And in my retirement month or two left in the PRC, this is the work that must really continue. And that's why I'm seeing Social Ethics Committee having a role. That's why I'm seeing litigation stroke legislative drafting having a role as a committee, not just litigation fund, so that they are not, limited to that. They look at where the bills and legislation is initiated. Before we could even litigate, we start by lobbying. And once we might have failed in lobbying, then we could think of litigating. So those are some of the structural adjustments that I would propose moving forward, so that whoever takes over come 19th of November, these are some of the things that must be discussed at board level. There are too many professionals in the BMF, and we should all be preoccupied with what matters for what we call historically disadvantaged people. So truck drivers are historically disadvantaged people. So we shouldn't look at them there as these are crazy people who are blockading the roads. They're raising genuine concerns, because in Africa alone, Ghana and other countries, Namibia, have made laws that protect low-skilled labor. They've made those laws, and they're unapologetic about it. With us, then we get to say a whole lot of things. So all what I'm just saying is there's a lot within the policy legislative realm that requires thought leadership. And I believe BMF and the young leaders like Monde, some of us are too old now. We're supposed to be playing with our grandchildren. So we should lead and give you this baton so that you move us forward. But thanks for this conversation. And I see there are quite a whole lot of conversation, including the one that talks to the professionalization of the BMF that is coming soon. I'm very excited, and I hope we keep the momentum post the triennial AGM. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to all the panelists and the organizers of this event.
Kaza, can I just tell you, after November 19, the BMF is not going to collapse, regardless of who's at the helm. I think these conversations and discussions and debates, particularly around policy and legislation, is actually to be had at branch levels, to be honest with you. To me, it's not a presidency debate. It is and I think, Monde, you perfectly place in terms of putting this out there to all members, so that there is participation across the nation in regards to, there may be other issues. I mean, Kaza just raised, and I wish you had your video on, because you're actually not that old to be having grandchildren. You still got many more years left of service in the BMF. We're not letting you go after the 19th of November. I don't know why you're making a thing about that date. So I think it's important that issues of truck drivers, issues of national minimum wage, issues of sectorial determination on the agribusiness, the fact that there's a lot of things. I mean, obviously we want to choose and be focused on what it is our mission and our vision is, but that doesn't exempt us from our social responsibility towards millions of South Africans that are vulnerable. So I think it's quite important, the issues of unemployment that's growing in a negative GDP country, the issues of the fact we don't have a sovereign wealth fund, we don't have reparations, We are a nation built on social security, and even that, is I mean, the 350 Rand, I don't know if that's being continued, but it creates stimulation in, our township economy. There's a lot of issues, Kaiser, that, that's just one of the tipping points. And I think we can definitely, as a membership-based organization, I mean, we can choose topics in each of our regions. We don't have to say, BMF must direct from a leadership presidency situation. So Monde, I think as head of policy, you must really distribute these topics and make branch leadership mancos resuscitate membership participation. That to me is an important takeaway from tonight's session, even though it wasn't planned to be. So Nonku, sorry, you're listening to BMF France here, but yeah.
Just to add the DP, thanks for the comments, Chair and DP, on that important issue. Last week, we actually had a leadership induction webinar, and this is one of the issues that we raised, that at a branch level, you want to start having these debates again, and recreating that thought leadership atmosphere within the branch. There's one specific issue that was raised by Mark Kuzwayo around some of the challenges in the branches. And she just said about 62% of the branches in the BMF are dysfunctional in terms of their report. So she made that statistic public. So I think the issue of rebuilding the branches is becoming a serious matter, especially around thought leadership. And I mean, even a branch can submit a particular view or position that the national office can adopt. They can do that work in conjunction with us or alone and sponsor a view and a position from the ground up. So definitely, I think there's a lot of space for members on the ground to engage in positions of the organization, policy work. What's the view on this issue? We're sponsoring this view. How far can we lobby for it? So I think there's a lot of potential again for us to rebuild some of these things from the ground up. So I just wanted to just add that point, that we've thrown it into the system for leaders to start thinking about as well. That actually we need to get back to the ground and feel the ground as well, and rebuild that thought leadership approach as well. So yeah, I just wanted to just add that quickly there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And Deputy, from your insights and your wisdom that you decided to share and put emphasis on the ethics committee, we see a lot of discussions on the chat group on disclosures, even for us as BMF. So thank you for that. And it ignited a new passion for accountability, which, as a closing remark on my side, that's what this bill is set out to improve, right? It's accountability, scrutiny on remuneration practices. It's there to promote shareholder activism and corporate governance. And I would like to urge members, if you receive any note for an AGM, either from a policy that you hold with a financial institution or your medical aid, it's so important to attend those and not just ignore, because that's where the change will come in. All of us attending those and pushing for change and social justice and addressing inequality with us one vote. That's how we can change the country. So that's just one day from my side, just on closing remarks.
Thank you. Sure, thank you very much, colleagues. It's also good to see some encouraging comments there. Sandile Koza saying, I've been a member, but after today, I want to contribute meaningfully at branch level. So that's great. Sandile, please go for it. And of course, on this particular bill, I'm sure you can see on your screen there that comments can be sent to dikoti.masemula@bmfonline.co.za. And I would like to just give you a deadline to midday tomorrow at 12. If there are no comments after 12 tomorrow, we'll start drafting our contribution. And then obviously we'll send it to PRC when we are done here at the head office. And then after they've made their input, then we're sending it through, and that would be the end of it. But In addition to that, there's something else that we're going to be working on in terms of having more conversations around corporate legislation, etc. Something we're going to start working on as well, so that we have more conversations of this nature in empowering our members and our leaders to have a better understanding of, Companies Act, etc., and all the other acts that are in the system that leaders ought to know. So definitely, there's still a lot for us to do. So if you're thinking about leaving the BMF, don't. The BMF is bigger than all of us. So it doesn't matter who discourages you. The organization is much bigger than all of us. So please stick with it. Doesn't matter what happens post 19 November. What is key is our individual commitment to ensuring that the mandate is executed at a personal level, at a branch level, at a provincial level, and nationally and beyond into the future. For Eric Mafuna says the BMF belongs to our great-grandchildren in the future. It does not belong to us. So having said that, thank you very much, colleagues. Have a good evening and take care.
Thank you and good evening. Thanks, Nonku and Monde and Itu and everyone that's on the platform for their contribution. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye.